From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. I'm filling in for Paul this week as he's off in Abu Dhabi. Today we're going to be talking about Libya and assessing where things stand nearly 8 years on from the revolution of 2011. We'll be discussing the situation on the ground, this week's summit in Palermo, and the prospects for elections and a political settlement more broadly. I'm joined today by a great guest, Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan is a non-resident scholar here at MEI who writes about Libya regularly. He's served in a variety of different capacities with the U.S. government over the years, including as the U.S. Special Envoy for Libya. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
To kind of kick things off, can you give us a sense of the kind of lay of the land in Libya? What's the situation on the ground? Who are the main players? It's a complicated situation, I know, but can you give us kind of the, in a nutshell, version?
Sure. In a nutshell, since January of 2016, following a Libyan political agreement reached in December 2015, there has been a government of national accord put together by the UN that's been the recognized government in Libya around the world, headed by Prime Minister al-Sarraj. That government is based in Tripoli. Meanwhile, in Tobruk, which is all the way to the east of the country, the House of Representatives, that's also part of the Libyan political agreement as the lower house and the main legislative body in the country, has been unwilling to endorse governments proposed by Prime Minister al-Sarraj, has voted those governments down, and continues to recognize a government that other countries don't recognize in the east, located in Beta, Libya. One result is that the country continues not to have national institutions that are recognized by everybody other than the national oil company, which generates almost all the country's hard currency, and the Central Bank of Libya, which collects that money and in turn provides it back to Libyans in the forms of salaries and funds the governments and funds the militias regardless of whether they support the government or not. So it's been something of a mess.
The militias is, I think, an excellent jumping off point as well. That's something that has been a major challenge for the country. I know in 2011, the transitional government started doling out those payments to the militias using central bank money. Some have argued that this was probably like kind of the worst decision made by the Libyans after Gaddafi's fall. Jonathan, what do you think should be done about the militias and specifically the issue of these payments?
Well, Libya clearly needs to have local police forces that are capable of dealing with serious criminals and providing the security policing function that people want from their cities all over the world. Libya also needs to have a national security force, a Libyan army that's national in scope, that represents the whole country and which is responsive to civilian leadership. And the failure of Gaddafi to build that in an institutional way adequately is part of why he wound up losing in the following the uprising in 2011. So Libya needs those national institutions instead of militias. And what it's got in militias is local warlords and militia leaders providing security. And from time to time they clash. When they clash, people wind up getting killed. And it's no basis for providing security for people. So there is a security crisis in the country. There's a political crisis. As I mentioned, one government doesn't recognize the other government. It's not unified throughout the country. And the House of Representatives, the parliament, refuses to allow the government in Tripoli really to function. And then the third element is an economic crisis. And the economic crisis is that there's a black market in Libyan dinars, which is a different rate from the official government rate. That creates all kinds of distortions in the Libyan economy. There's been a banking crisis where people won't keep money in the banks because they don't trust them. The country's been bleeding revenue because it provides subsidies to oil, a lot of which gets smuggled and winds up supporting criminal groups and militias. And all three of these things need to be reformed in an integrated way. There needs to be one government, a national security force that can be brought in to maintain order and to combat criminality. And there needs to be a way that revenues get not just to a central government, but to local municipal councils to provide services to people at the local level, as well as to ordinary Libyans as a matter of their being Libyan. The country has enough money to do this if it's pumping its oil. And if it is pumping its oil, it ought to do that. Now, if you had individual Libyans getting paid not because they're a member of militias, but as of right, and if you revalue the currency to the black market rate and eliminated the subsidies, and if you were paying money to municipalities, all of a sudden, you've got lots of sources of stability. You've got people who want to keep the payments going to them individually. You've got localities saying we want the municipalities to continue to get money to provide services at the local level where there can be some accountability. And you've also got the militias no longer being paid as much in real terms because they're being paid at a rate now where the value of those old salaries has declined as a result of the black market rate applying across the board.
So almost a universal basic income.
Yes, a universal basic income.
Okay.
And then you phase out salaries to militias and you pay the new army higher salaries than the old militias, which creates an incentive for people who become soldiers, become fighters to apply for and be trained into a new army at a national level. And you put together old officers of the old Gaddafi army, vetted in a way that it makes them has them be non-political, and they weren't particularly political before, most of the officers. And you have them vetted in across the whole country, so they represent each region, and then you have what begins to look like a government. And there's more than enough money to go around if you're pumping 1.5 million barrels a day, which is a baseline for Libya, and oil is $50 a barrel or more. You do that, and you're talking about roughly $30 billion a year, which for a country of 5 to 6 million people is more than enough for the hard currency necessary to buy the food, the medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, and other basics Libyans need.
One of the other issues is the question of kind of institutions and capacity building. How has the kind of impact of decades of dictatorship, and specifically the kind of type of dictatorship that the Gaddafi regime represented in terms of its policy of statelessness, how has that kind of created additional challenges when looking at kind of building up state institutional structures?
You know, if you look on websites, government websites in Russia or China or most African countries, let alone the European Union or North America or Oceania, you find massive numbers of government documents online and available in all kinds of areas. This is including societies like Russia, where you wouldn't expect that based on the political system, but they're there. I have never met a Libyan who uses a .ly email address. I have never seen a Libyan government document come to me in the form of out of an electronic database. That might be a slight exaggeration. The National Oil Company might have them. But by and large, the government ministries do not have them. Libya did not modernize its IT systems and its systems for government. Gaddafi was in power for 42 years, a long time, and it hasn't done so over the past 8 years either. There are tremendous opportunities here for modernization by just taking the kinds of systems adopted in the Gulf, for example, and applying them to Libya at the municipal level, and then from there building it up to the national level. So the work that could be done and done quickly, public financial administration and IT, could begin to revolutionize the way Libya does business. You apply that in turn to things like contracting, where electronic databases allow you to see what's happened and keep track of things, put in good procurement practices, you could get a lot done in this country. But to do there is going to require first political agreement on a path forward. The country doesn't have a constitution that's been in place in decades. Gaddafi suspended the constitution and operated by the form of a constitutional declaration, which is a partial constitution for years. It's been amended since then a couple of times for the current governments. Libyans deserve to have a constitution, which provides them a permanent structure for government, regular elections, the kind of predictability and organization that makes it easier to govern, as opposed to making it a fight, no matter what decisions you want to make.
Right. In terms of the political settlement that you've kind of spoken about, what do you ultimately think that will look like? Surely there needs to be, given the kind of history and sensitivities in Libya, some degree of kind of local control or regional autonomy. What do you see that looking like?
Well, again, I believe that if you made payments to municipalities on a per capita basis and made revenue sharing a regular part of the government, That would take care of an awful lot of the disagreements that there have been between, in particular, the eastern coastal areas, which felt neglected under Gaddafi, and the West. The South has never been given very much. So it would also provide a foundation for building up the South. Now, in addition, the South could have model cities in which you begin to have the infrastructure put together to create a watering hole, to create a place for people who've been nomadic for many, 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 many generations to go to, that provides for education and healthcare in a local way. And you could put those kind of satellite, small, built-up model cities in various border regions of Libya, and that would be great for the South, in addition to making payments to municipalities. But all of that would be a positive because they were never paid attention to before. I don't believe, by contrast, that coming up with the old administrative divisions of Cyrenaica and Fezzan and Tripolitania to the west is going to do anything, is going to work. They don't correspond to the physical realities of Libya. They don't correspond to the oil grid, and they don't correspond to existing municipal structures. By contrast, there are additional regions, that administrative regions created under Gaddafi, and they might work, but I'm not sure that they'd be better than doing it initially at a municipal level and then having some things administered nationally. That's the kind of discussion, though, that Libyans need to have. Libyans are going to have to live with it. You could have them advised by international technocrats, but Libyans should be making these decisions, not special envoys, even from a well-intentioned country like the United States.
Speaking of kind of that conversation, then, can you give us a little bit more information on the kind of diplomatic efforts that have been taking place in the run-up to the Palermo summit? I know we've seen several kind of previous initiatives and rounds of talks looking at for example, the UN action plan that was launched in late 2017, the Paris talks earlier this year. They kind of fizzled out. What did those involve? Why did they fail? And what looks different about Palermo?
Well, Libyans are expert boycotters. And the first things that Libyan political leaders will do if they don't like the way something's going is refuse to show up. If they do show up, they're good at signing agreements and then ignoring them. They're also good at not signing agreements, but when they sign them, they often then ignore them. So the question becomes always the follow-up and how you institutionalize decisions when they're made. The Paris summit did not institutionalize any decisions, and it wasn't done with the full participation of the UN SRSG, Ghassan Salameh. It was done too quickly, and the agreement was pretty much repudiated and pretty much a dead letter within weeks. Indeed, some could argue that the fighting that took place in the Oil Crescent in July was one response to the agreements made in June, and that the fighting took place in Tripoli in September was yet another. In any case, there are not going to be elections in December 2018, as the Paris meetings called for. Now, Palermo, by contrast, didn't promise to deliver very much. It really was designed to try and get people more or less saying, yes, we agree with the plan that the UN SRSG, Ghassan Salameh, has tried to put in place, and we're on board with that. And they more or less got that. Now, there were some negatives that happened too. General Haftar, the head of the self-created Libyan National Army, refused to show up for the meetings in Palermo. He then showed up in Palermo, but not at the Italian chaired meeting, but at a side meeting. This in turn upset Turkey, and Turkey wound up leaving the conference in disgust because it was excluded from the side meeting. That was all not tremendously constructive. You need to have Turkey, like you need to have Egypt, participate. They are relevant actors, whether you like a country or don't like a country. And I'm not expressing a view one way or another. They're necessary to it. Having General Haftar or anyone picking and choosing what they participate in winds up not being constructive but being problematic, because if one Libyan does that, another Libyan can do it. And pretty soon nobody's talking to anybody and everything is broken down. So there was some positives to Palermo and that general consensus to try and move ahead with the UN plan with different deadlines, different dates, and some negatives, some acting out that was discouraging. What happens next? The internationals need to be aligned with one another so that they don't play Libyans off one another or vice versa. The UN SRSG needs to find ways to get the Libyans to actually implement the plan. Now, there have been hints already that the UN is ready to look for alternatives to the House of Representatives in its current incarnation under the stewardship of House of Representatives Speaker Aguila, because Speaker Aguila has tended not to allow votes to advance anything. And he's tended not to allow them because he's done pretty well under the current situation. He's had more money to spend and resources from raiding banks in the East to fund the government to the East, and from the dinars, the counterfeit dinars provided by the Russian state printer Gaznak, billions of Libyan dinars, than the East has ever really had before, certainly more than he ever had before. And he doesn't really want to give up the power that he's had. And one can't blame him. Who wants to give up power if you don't have to give up power?
Indeed.
So the question becomes whether the UN will find a path around him if he's unwilling to allow anything to move forward in order to preserve his own power. And in the end, that's the question for the international community as well as for Libyans. What do you do to counter people who just want to retain the status quo? Do you need to have another crisis? Does it have to be a Libya without electricity, a Libya without water, a Libya with a massive humanitarian crisis, a Libya that's generating millions of refugees? Does it have to deteriorate to that level in order to force change? Or can you get change without that kind of deterioration? That's the goal now.
Well, in some respects, it seems like that's the objective in pushing for the fresh set of elections in 2019, talking in January, and then holding them sometime in kind of March to June, creating a sort of a new opening and perhaps bringing in some people that might be a little bit more amenable to reconciliation. Does that seem plausible to you? Does that seem like a realistic time frame as well?
It's all realistic if the internationals are aligned, if they in turn find enough Libyans who are willing to look at the bigger picture and say, this is what the country needs. There are lots of Libyans who are moderate, reasonable, capable of compromise. It's always hardliners who get in the way of that. I met Mr. Aguila a number of times, worked hard to try and get him to move. Many other people did as well. I felt over time that there was really nothing that he was willing to do if it was going to potentially threaten his power. And that's a problem. All I ask is not that he keep power, give up power, or anything else, but that he allow his House of Representatives to vote on things like scheduling elections, scheduling a constitutional referendum. If he's not going to allow the government of national accord to function, he could at least do that. I'm not convinced that he will on his own. The UN Deputy SRSG reportedly floated a plan, which I assume is actually a Ghassan Salame UN plan, to see if Libyans meeting together wanted to ask the UN Security Council to create a date certain for elections and referendum at their request, and to repeal their recognition of the existing government institutions as of a date, so that the status quo would no longer result in de facto or de jure recognition of the people who have power now. Some plan along those lines may be where things go if we continue to have a complete failure to act by the Libyan parliament. Libya's upper house, which does not have legislative authority, the state council, has already had a leadership change. So the new leader, Mr. al-Misri, will be tested by events, and we'll see what he does. There are people who call him Muslim Brotherhood or Islamist. The question will be, what does he allow to happen? Is he going to be on the side of democracy or not? I think he still has an opportunity to prove that he is on the side of democracy. His initial response to things has been positive and constructive, according to a lot of Libyans that I've talked to. But it will be tested over time.
In terms of looking ahead to 2019, what's your kind of prognosis? What are you going to be paying particularly close attention to in the next few months?
I pay attention to every word that Ghassan Salame utters. He's an extraordinarily capable international diplomat. He's wise, he's smart, he's hardworking, he understands the scene, and he has indicated impatience with the status quo, which he considers to be unsustainable. I'm going to look at oil production. As long as Libya is producing 1 million barrels a day or more, even 800,000 actually, but 1 million ideally, it can manage. It's not going to collapse. There won't be a humanitarian crisis. If Libyans start shutting down the oil again, that's a sign of crisis. If they're still producing the oil and distributing it, even if they're not distributing it very well, Libya can go on the way it is. I'm going to be watching what Egypt has to say, what the Emirates have to say, because they can play an extraordinarily important constructive role in Libya's future by not picking sides, but by telling those who have been close to them, you have to deal. You have to find ways of breaking bread with others in other parts of the country to coming to common solutions. I think those are the people I'm going to pay attention to in the first instance, and then I'm going to pay attention to Russia, because those Russian banknotes played a huge role in dividing Libya in 2016 and 17 and preventing the success of the Government of National Accord. And there's press reports which suggest Russia may have various military things that they're doing as well. They've been very visible with General Haftar in the east. A divide and conquer strategy might work for Russia. I don't know. It's certainly not going to be good for Libya.
Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts on all of this. Also, thank you to our audience for listening in, and thank you to our colleague Scott Zucchi, who produced today's program. We will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.